My name is Misty Herget. I'm with the North Carolina Rural Center. We are a statewide nonprofit that serves 80 rural counties across the state with a focus on economic development. And we are thrilled to have you join us today for our second webinar in the series of 4 that we are conducting throughout this month. Last week's focus in our webinar was the why to importance of resilience strategies. And this week we are going to dig into how that works on the ground. We had a lot of enthusiasm and energy around last week's webinar. We were honored to have Dr. Kathy Dello, our state climatologist, join us for that webinar. If you missed it and are interested in viewing it, you can go to the Rural Center's YouTube channel, which is Rural Center NC, and view the recording of that. Again, today's webinar continues our theme of building to withstand the storms to come, focusing on natural disasters and how to build resilient communities to withstand those natural disasters and still thrive. We are very fortunate today to have with us Dr. Jess Whitehead. She's the Chief Resilience Officer with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And Mr. Kim Colson, he is the Director of the Division of Water Infrastructure with the Department of Environmental Quality with the state of North Carolina. Also, I want to thank the Red Cross for their support in this webinar series. We are grateful to them for that. Also, compliments of them is a gift packet, an safety emergency pack. If you complete the evaluation after the webinar, you will be entered into a drawing to potentially receive that prize. So we're very excited about that, very grateful to them for that. And with that, just a couple of things about logistics for today. If you are on social media, we would love for you to tweet about the webinar at NC Rural Center. If you would tag us and Red Cross as well, you can see those social media handles on the slide. Also, we are on Instagram and Facebook. I'm just going to go through the agenda and a few more logistics, and then we will kick off. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, we have Dr. Whitehead. She's going to begin today, and then we will transition to Mr. Colson, and then we will have time at the end for Q&A. And if you will use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and we will moderate and feed those questions to our 2 panelists. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll discuss the 2 upcoming sessions, those topics and how you register for those. So with that, again, if you'll use, when we switch to the Q&A section, if you'll use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will hopefully get as many questions answered as possible. And I'm not going to take up any more time, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you again to the Rural Center and to the American Red Cross for funding this series. We've been really excited as we've worked with the Rural Center a little bit, putting together some of the topics for this full series. And let's go ahead and launch in. We'll go to the next slide. And what I'm going to cover, I think I have about 30 minutes, is based on the survey results for those of you who were here last week, and then knowing that we have a large number of attendees this week who are new, we're going to back it up a little bit and talk about resilience. And this time thinking about resilience in the context of North Carolina. From there, we'll go over how you begin thinking about risks, because we know that this can be challenging. Even when you've experienced storms as devastating as Matthew and Florence and Dorian and Isaias, or if you're up in the mountains and you've dealt with landslides and wildfires, we know that it's still hard to think about what those might do in the future based on what you've experienced in the past. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll go through some of the different ways that we can act, and specifically knowing that Mr. Colson is going to be covering water infrastructure, I'll really focus my remarks on housing, natural and nature-based infrastructure, and transportation resilience. But I'll also step it back some to really talk about resilience across your community. And then lastly, if we get time, because I do tend to get a little long-winded, We'll talk about how we fund some of our actions. And don't worry, if we don't get there, you'll get the slides after the presentation, and I've made sure that those are still in the deck. So let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. There's a lot of different definitions of resilience out there. If you're an academic or you're on Twitter and you follow any of the disaster risk reduction and emergency management accounts, there was a whole argument on Twitter this Sunday about what's the definition of resilience. Trying to break it down in a not academic situation, because we all have to live this, right? There is, really a concept out there of resilience is the punching bag. If you have something knock you down, you get back up again, and coming back to that baseline. And this is a definition that doesn't really hit home for me or for the rest of our staff at NCORE, because really, we look back and we look at where we were. Can any of us really say that turning the clock back to October 1st of 2016, before Hurricane Matthew hit, that's the best that North Carolina can be? We all know that our communities faced a whole lot of challenges. We had an affordable housing crisis before Matthew hit. We had a crisis in the maintenance of our water and wastewater infrastructure and of our transportation infrastructure before Matthew hit. And so really, is that going to be the baseline that's good enough for us in the future? The next slide then, and I'll probably back it up here a little bit to who we are and who NCORE is. NCORE was established in 2018 by Governor Cooper and the General Assembly to administer disaster recovery funds, in particular the HUD CDBG funds that we already had from Matthew and we knew we were going to be receiving from Florence. But there's also a resilience component of NCORE, and that's where my team comes in. We're not necessarily tied to the daily administration of those disaster funds. Our job is to really think about how do we make the state resilient for future disasters and for climate change. And the way that my team takes this approach, it's myself and 2 deputy chief resilience officers, is really thinking about resilience not as a punching bag, but as a state of our communities and the systems that we're all a part of. Part of it is social. It's our connections with each other. It's our connections with volunteer groups and faith communities and governments and our neighbors and our friends. It's the economic connections. How do our communities thrive, whether it's agriculture and forestry or fishing, or even in our urban areas, the urban drivers of local resilience and technology industries. And then also the environment. Most of us live in North Carolina because it's a great place to live. And that characteristic of our natural environment is part of our heritage, it's part of our culture. And in many cases, when we think about natural flood protection, it's something that can really help us out as we're thinking about the future, because it has these social and environmental benefits, not just because it's green, although we like that part. So the next slide then is really our team's vision of what a resilient North Carolina looks like. It's not just thinking about hazard mitigation and about the kinds of projects that you can individually put out after a disaster to repair damage or maybe to elevate a few homes. We're really stepping back and thinking about this triple bottom line of social, economic, and environmental resilience and how all of those weave together to make North Carolina the place that we love. And in that view of resilience, we think about it not just as bouncing back after a shot, the punching bag swinging back to normal, but really being able to adapt to and thrive no matter what hits us. Whether we're talking about a natural hazard like a hurricane, or we're talking about a pandemic, or we're talking about climate change in the future, we want North Carolina to continue to be able to be a place for all of us with great quality of life, really healthy economic growth, and all of these durable systems that make us, ready not just for ourselves, but for our kids and our grandkids. So the next slide is, some of these dimensions of resilience in a community. Last week, Dr. Dello, and I highly recommend her presentation if you missed it, really talked about resilience from the perspective of the hazards to which we're exposed, both past and future. But the dimensions of resilience in a community and what it really means, whether you're talking about Murphy or Whiteville or Asheboro or Asheville. What does it mean to be resilient? And we're talking about the ways that we're prepared, whether that's our infrastructure preparedness, whether that's our social preparedness, and are we prepared to support each other when bad things happen? Are we prepared to support each other to be able to make good things happen? That kind of disaster preparation and long-term planning preparation from the household level all the way up to the state. It's how connected are we? Are we ready to help each other? Do the right people know each other? Do they communicate often enough? Are our needs being heard? Are our needs being met? And then adaptive. Sometimes the way that we've always done things is not going to be the same way that we can continue to do things in the future. And we know full well that everything changes. The North Carolina of today is not what North Carolina looked like when any of us were kids. And the North Carolina of today is not what it's going to look like when any of our children are our age. So, thinking about that adaptive ability to be able to change and accommodate these things is super important. So the next slide really talks about how to take kind of this nebulous stuff and think about it in your everyday life. So thinking about ways to connect inside and outside of your community is a key part of making resilience thinking a part of every day. Opportunities to learn about future risks, like Dr. Dello talked about last week, like I'll talk about a little bit again today, like I'm sure all of you know from sharing your experiences with past disasters. And then really beginning to think about how do we avoid that suffering in those areas that we know were risky in the past, will continue to be risky in the future, and areas that maybe aren't risky right now, but will be on those margins in the future. How do we invest and upgrade wisely? How do we really think not just about, we're not saying don't develop at all, but when you do develop, when you do grow, make sure that you keep those hazards in mind so that when you use those dollars, you're using them as efficiently as you can for today and for tomorrow. And then also really integrating resilience across your plans and your programs. Whether you're here from a municipality, whether you're here representing a faith community or a community organization, think about how resilience cuts across everything that you do and make sure that it becomes the heart of making all of these plans and programs talk to each other efficiently. So the next slide, all of these things are much easier said than done. So one of the first things that my office did when we started last summer was think about, there's a whole lot of resources out there on how to assess your risks or how to develop a resilience plan or how to do an adaptation plan. But there's a lot of communities who have started to do this in North Carolina, and there were some things that they needed to think of before they got started if they were going to be successful. And it was things like thinking about who was going to be the champion for resilience in your community, who needed to be a part of the conversation, how to make sure that everyone is included, how to think about those future risks, how to engage, and how to begin thinking about acting. It's these steps that are really important to think about before you launch into doing anything that really sets you up for success. And so what we did was we've created a natural hazards quick start guide. It's super short. By the time you take the pictures out, I promise it's only about 10 pages of text. We checked. And something that is really designed to be accessible for you to begin thinking about these foundational things you need to do in your community to be successful before you start thinking about what it's going to look like when you cut the ribbon on a project. So the next slide, not just talking about collaboration then, but how do you think about future risks? And why did you get a climate change talk last week? Well, we know that you all know have lived through Matthew, for Florence. If you're inland, you lived through Michael, you've had wildfires, you have landslides. You don't need any of us to tell you that those things are problems. So why do we then begin to bring up climate change, and why is this a focus of the state now? And it's really because what happens, the analogy that I like to use here, and maybe I'm dating myself, is thinking about if anybody like me is old enough to remember the steroid scandal in baseball. Anybody on this call who's younger is probably scratching your head, but it was a big deal to find out that there was a lot of use of steroids in baseball. And it wasn't that the use of steroids helped any individual player hit the biggest number of home runs in a season. It's not that set the record. What it did was tip the scales to make it more likely that when somebody hits a home run, they're going to hit that ball faster. It's going to go farther than it otherwise would if somebody wasn't juicing. So when we think about climate change, then this is why it matters. Because if we're thinking about, especially in rural areas, y'all know what a big game changer it is when you get a grant to upgrade your infrastructure or to do something in your business district or to create something that really helps your local community organizations and your health system. That's a huge game changer in rural areas. And so thinking about investing that as wisely as possible so that you get 20, 30, 50 years out of that investment, we have to start asking the climate question, because climate change really takes those hazards that we have in North Carolina that we know are already stressors on our fisheries or our land management or our farms or our water and wastewater infrastructure or erosion and erosion control, and juices those up just like a baseball player with steroids. So the next slide, we have a new resource for you as communities. This was done as part of Governor Cooper's Executive Order 80. One portion of that was for the state to produce a climate risk assessment and resilience plan. Dr. Dello already went through a lot of this last week, so I'm not going to cover it. But for those of you who missed it, who need to go back, I promise you it's well worth your time to go back and watch that online. Thinking about this, it takes what we know nationally from the U.S. climate assessment, this nationally produced 13 federal agencies that came out in 2017 and 2018, fourth national climate assessment, takes that data and pulls out what's relevant to North Carolina. And it communicates it in a way that really begins to try to say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and this is how it applies to you. You don't necessarily care about a rainfall trend line. I get that. But what you care about is how often are you going to have to deal with really, really big rainfalls? How often are you going to have to deal with extreme heat waves that last longer and that don't cool off as much at night as they used to? How are you going to have to deal, if you live in a coastal area, with flooding that doesn't get into people's houses, but it's annoying enough to cover up the roads several times a year and then several more times a year? And then eventually, you start to get to the point where some places in southeastern Virginia, the churches literally have tide tables posted so that people know which side of the street to park on for Sunday service. So it begins to try to take some of this information and communicate it to you more in a way that you can use. The next slide is then the statewide climate risk assessment and resilience plan. This was admittedly done by the perspective of state agencies because the cabinet agencies and the state employees were the ones who participated, but we did a large number of workshops and had participation from local governments telling us what the state needed to think about in this. And I provide it, even though it is a very state agency centric report, because a lot of it talks about the different ways that we need to begin helping local governments think about this and have local governments help us think about this. And if you've never thought about how climate change affects you before, this chapter 5 goes through a number of sectors. Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services actually wrote the agriculture and forestry section based on climate research that that department has been doing. Technically, this executive order only applied to cabinet agencies. They didn't even have to participate in this, and they did, because they recognize how important it is to agriculture and to forestry. So it's a really great way to look through, and if you've never thought of this before, think about the different ways that climate affects you. The next slide. So thinking about the risks, the next thing that you want to think about is how do you approach this in a community? Everybody wants to jump straight to the project. Everybody wants to do that. I respect that approach, but especially in rural areas where you know how hard it is to get the funding, you really want to try to step back and think about, what are your goals, principles, and values? And how do you work these into all of these different plans that may or may not apply to your municipality, whether or not it's your economic development strategy or your regional hazard mitigation plan or if you're coastal, a coastal land use or shoreline management plan, a stormwater plan, your disaster recovery plans. Think about all of these things, because what you really want to think about is, you know, everybody, especially in rural communities, is so busy. So how do you prioritize your effort and get the most bang for your buck and deal with those biggest issues first? And stepping back to make sure you have a plan then before you leap to the project becomes really, really important. And so things that go into, you know, resilience plans, whether you formally have a separate plan or you just look at it in the context of all of these other plans you already have, there's no right way to do it. Both options are completely valid, whatever works for you. You know, thinking about what kind of strategies can you use? What's your public engagement? How do you work with the people who live in your community? How do you develop pathways to get things done? Nobody wants to plan for the sake of plan. We want to plan so that we know what to do and coordinate who's going to do it. How do we know whether or not we've been successful? And then you can take that and begin to get into the project. You want to try to think about the ways that you prioritize, put that effort into the thing that gets you the most risk reduction, and risk reduction might be the size of the flood. Risk reduction might be, you know, the most important thing to your community might be the pain that your business district experiences. It might be opportunities, because it's a low-hanging fruit, to work with your farmers and talk to them about things like no-till and cover crops that can actually reduce flooding. There's any number of priorities that could be different in any one of our North Carolina communities, but that's something that you need to decide. The state doesn't need to decide for you. And again, the same kind of ideas of success metrics and how do you fund it and how do you implement. So the next slide is the cross-sector resilience strategies that the state puts forth in our plan that I think are probably a good starting point for a lot of rural communities to think about resilience. What kind of resilience criteria can you have when you make an investment in infrastructure? What are the plan standards and design values? Are you designing for a big enough storm for the future 20 years from now? Can you increase your resilience capacity? Not just thinking about projects, but economic development, community development, identifying funding. This is a big one for all of us. And big thing to engage how we're communicating and making sure that everyone is a part of this process. We are only as resilient as our least resilient members of our communities. So the next slide, kind of setting up some ideas here for resilience at home, things that you can do at home, knowing your flood risk, thinking about elevating and avoiding first floor enclosures if you are in a flood zone or in a future flood zone. Exploring living shorelines and purchasing flood insurance. Yes, I know flood insurance is getting more expensive. But then also thinking in your community. And these are some of the things that I'm going to talk about. You know, mapping and documenting those lessons learned. I've already talked a little bit about participating in resilience planning, but then beginning to think about how to incorporate these future conditions into your land use plans, your infrastructure, your architectural design for buildings. How do you use natural and nature-based solutions? And how do you look for funding to do this? Because we all know it takes money and it takes people. So the next slide I'm going to present is an example of how planning was used in the town of Swansboro. This is a project that the town of Swansboro collaborated with the Division of Coastal Management, North Carolina Sea Grant, and the Nature Conservancy and Coastal Federation on, to begin thinking about how did they want to conserve their wetlands. You can pave over a wetland when you're doing development, but the ugly truth is when you dump 30 inches of rain on it, the place that was a wetland is still going to want to act like a wetland, and then it becomes a flood. And this was something the town of Swansboro started and was in the process of. They've literally done a meeting about 10 days before Florence hit. I was a part of that meeting in my previous position. And they were thinking, oh, the worst case scenario could be 10 to 15 inches of rain. And so how would we protect these things? How could we use the wetlands that we still have to our advantage? 10 days later, the town of Swansboro recorded 30 inches of rain for the storm total for Hurricane Florence. So it was a really great time for them to map out and realize what are the opportunities there for us to direct development into that higher ground and safer places, and where are the places where we want to make sure that wetlands can work for us instead of against us. The next slide, talking about housing and community resilience. Again, knowing your flood risk, purchasing flood insurance, a little bit more about home elevation, because this is something that we do a lot, either through hazard mitigation grant programs or through our new HUD programs. Looking at whether or not elevation is an option for a home, but remember, especially if you're somewhere where flooding is becoming more frequent, you're elevating the home, but you're not elevating the car. You're not elevating the roadway leading to the home. You're not elevating the septic. You're not elevating the water or the wastewater. So keeping in mind that you can keep the house from being damaged, but there's still an emergency management response that you're going to need to do because that place is going to flood under that house. Considering flood proofing when you can't elevate a structure. And honestly, I know we don't like to talk about it, but strategic retreat and thinking about buyouts and opportunities for places where this is somewhere that's flooded once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times. Maybe it's just not the safest place for somewhere to be. But if we can help that homeowner move to high ground and think about how to do that before you apply for the funding, you put that homeowner in a better situation and you create opportunities to use the land afterward for some kind of flood control, especially natural and nature-based solutions that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But make sure that that affordable housing that you're reconstructing is built up on high ground. You really don't want to be putting people who are economically vulnerable, who are socially vulnerable, from the frying pan into the fire on flooding. So thinking about ways to reconstruct that affordable housing on high ground so that those people can remain safe, because they're always the people with the fewest resources after a disaster to be able to bounce back. Community scale protection on the next slide, thinking a little bit about stormwater management for communities. This can be anything in coastal areas of Hyde County. The first 2 pictures that are there on the left and the center are of things like tide gates to keep water from coming in and out of Lake Mattamuskeet during a surge, or even just little slaps on culverts that you have to keep water from backflowing during a flood. Or you could look for really creative opportunities like they've done in town of Nags Head, where they actually have looked at neighborhood scale flooding and realized that there are some places that they can draw down the groundwater 72 hours ahead of a storm, enough so that the first flush of that water goes into recharging the groundwater table and not into people's homes. So different ways that you can think about community scale protection. And the next slide, when those are not options, talking about the opportunities for buyouts. This is the Rebuild NC, which is part of, it's the HUD branded funding that NCORE and the most of the rest of NCORE administers. But what NCORE is doing is trying to step back and recognize the problems that we've had when buyouts have been done in the past in North Carolina. You take a house here, you take a house there, you take a house there. We don't care where you're going, but don't stay here. And it ends up being not a good situation for the homeowner, not a good situation for the community. So how do we look within the regs of the federal programs to try to create something that does work? And what everybody else at NCORE who works on this has come up with is a paired option of developing zones of targeted buyouts so that they can reduce that checkerboarding problem, and then also providing financial incentives for homeowners to remain in their communities. There's an incentive to stay within North Carolina, and then there's also an additional incentive if you buy outside of the floodplain but stay within that tax base. And then pairing that with an affordable housing program that focuses on that affordable and safe housing. The next slide just has some details, and I'm going to skip this for time and go straight to the following slide and talk about some natural and nature-based solutions. This is the big thing, and it's been around for a while. But the game changer now is that FEMA, through BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, and then also through some FEMA policy changes that came down to within the last week for all of their programs that have traditionally really biased those programs toward hard kind of structures and flood control, and opening up the opportunity to be able to fund these natural and nature-based solutions in a way that we haven't been able to do before. So this is things like restoring grasslands and wetlands and stream banks and floodplains and dunes, creating living shorelines. This is a photograph of Durant Point on Hatteras Island. On that, you can't put a living shoreline on oceanfront where you have velocity, but you have a good quiet spot. You can install a marsh sill and you can see the difference between the before and even just fairly recently after the project started back in 2013, of how much shoreline they've been able to accrue in a place that had been eroding. Soil stabilization measures, working with your farmers. This is actually an idea that comes out of places like Iowa, places like Cedar Rapids that have also, you don't think of inland flooding, but Cedar Rapids has had devastating floods. And so the city of Cedar Rapids has been working several counties up the watershed from where they are with their farmers to work on the ways that they're managing their farms and their land and seeing actual reductions in their floods. Bioretention systems, low impact development, and green infrastructure, all examples of the kinds of things. The next slide is a kind of old example, but I really like it. The information in it is pretty much still good. It comes from 2007, but for those of you who know Bill Hunt from NC State University, talking about constructed wetlands and the opportunities. We've often thought of these for water quality, but these provide volume control too. And so putting back wetlands that we've lost, and part of why I like this, even though it's really old, is it's written so that it can be really accessible. You don't have to be an agricultural engineer or a biological engineer to be able to read through this book the stormwater guidance that you've got. And so that's one of the resources I wanted to leave you with. Another idea, the next slide, is thinking about greenways in your community. You know, some of the places that you flood might be places where you want to create that and develop it into a recreational amenity. This is actually the Neuse River Greenway shortly after Florence when I was going for a run and had to run through a little bit of the Neuse River. Instead of that being homes, that was a greenway. Neuse River comes up, the greenway floods. The worst that I got out of it or anybody else got out of it was some wet shoes. The river goes back down. We all continue to go about our business. That greenway provides an amenity in blue sky conditions that then provides you a real economic benefit in terms of not needing big kind of disaster funds and dealing with the pain that people have to go through, whether or not they have insurance, in terms of when you have a flood. The next slide, talking about transportation vulnerabilities. This is one where thinking about things like, our roads going to be temporarily flooded? Are roads going to be permanently flooded if you live in the coastal zone? And by coastal zone, I don't mean just oceanfront. I mean, if you're on the Albemarle Sound or the Pamlico Sound, you're all the way inland to Washington County, Berkeley County. These are the kinds of places where you know that you get wind-driven tides and ultimately sea level rise is an issue. Is that stormwater infrastructure big enough? This is a big area of research, is how do you figure out how to upsize stormwater infrastructure to be big enough that you can still afford and then be able to emergency manage your way out of what you can't afford to mitigate. Are pavement and tracks going to fail faster? If you have a whole lot of fluctuating temperatures, that pavement's not going to last as long. And really, what's feasible in these situations? Can you elevate a road out of a floodplain? Can you make that culvert bigger? In some cases, you might need to relocate a facility outside of that floodplain. If it's a port, for example, and really thinking about different ways to prioritize projects. So the ones you're putting that effort into first are the ones where you're restoring a road to make sure that you've got at least one way in and out during a flood. The next slide talks a little bit about some of these opportunities. And then the following slide is an example from some of where our partners at the North Carolina Department of Transportation are. They're really seeing mapping as the first step so that they can target what do we do first and what are the biggest things we need to do first and what can we wait on. So being able to take the tools that we have and lay them on with each other. They've got some pilot studies going on in the Neuse River corridor, specifically looking at inundation and what some of those road redundancies are, whether or not they've got options for which roads and which bridges and which assets, and looking for chances to maximize that redundancy. The next slide is another example, again, from the Neuse River Basin, and this is courtesy of Will McDowell at the Environmental Defense Fund, but it really represents a partnership between North Carolina State University, Goldsboro, Wayne County, EDF, a number of other partners to try to map and look at what are the options that are maybe not hard structures. And some of the modeling that has been done by Dr. Barbara Dahl at NC State University finds that all they need to do is create some kind of natural or nature-based solution that can hold back 1,400 acre-feet of water, and you basically reduce a whole lot of the magnitude of the water that you get in today's 100-year flood event by about 28%. And it's a little hard to see because I mashed it onto one slide, but those vertical lines there are the elevations of the road. And you can see in a couple places that 28% doesn't sound like much, but that 28% reduction is potentially enough to keep Highway 70 from overtopping, to keep it from overtopping at Wayne Memorial. So looking for those kind of opportunities that often are a little bit easier to fund because they're smaller projects than a great big levee or a great big dry detention facility. So next slide, I'm actually going to really, I think, fly through these pretty quickly. I give you a number of federal funding sources. The next slide is the state and local funding sources. And then the final slide I want to mention, because it is a partnership both with us, Division of Coastal Management, the Rural Center, the Nature Conservancy, North Carolina Sea Grant, is this new North Carolina Resilient Communities program. It's got 3 goals, really focused on building local capacity for assessments and providing technical assistance and funds to be able to get things done. I'm going to skip the next slide and head to this slide. At this point, we don't have we've got enough state funding to provide the match, but what we did was we've gone out for 2 projects. NCORE and the Rural Center have a new grant from the Economic Development Administration. And then DCM, NCORE, Sea Grant, and TNC have a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to do some of this training and capacity building on resilience, to do a lot of this planning and to help communities with this implementation. I'm going to go ahead and let's see, next slide, we'll flip through. That just covers some of the boundaries of the Coastal Communities Program for those of you who are in coastal areas. The next slide is the program objectives. And I'm going to skip more to what we have here for the EDA grant because this is new. It's from the Economic Development Administration and it's a collaboration with NCORE and the Rural Center and with support from the Councils of Government. The next slide kind of overviews where we're going to be going between now and July of 2022 with 3 phases: to establish a statewide resilience framework, and then to really partner with the Rural Center through the Homegrown Leaders Program. So if you've seen advertisements for that, we really encourage you to apply. There's going to be a resilience component to that that's new, added on to all of the great content that you already expect from the Rural Center. And then based on that and in partnership with that, starting to do some regional coaching and then providing technical capacity to local communities to be able to identify and think about these risks in regions and partnerships, because it is hard for a single rural jurisdiction, or municipality, town to do this. But if you partner with others in your region, then you can really start to get somewhere. So starting off these regional resilience partnerships and portfolios will be really important. So with that, I want to close the final slide by leaving you with our guiding principles. Really, this is another one that comes out of the state, and we're going to be looking at how these apply in the context of doing the statewide resiliency framework. What does this look like in a local jurisdiction? Thinking really quickly and acting decisively on what we already know that we need to do to reduce the impacts of climate change and of disasters, but then also stepping back and thinking thoughtfully and collaboratively about the really challenging problems that we have to face in our communities. As we're doing this, we want to make sure that we're providing ways to invest in safe and affordable and connected communities. So a lot of things that you're already thinking about in the context of healthcare or broadband, these are also things that help you be resilient in disaster and really begin to strengthen these regional economies while also supporting healthy communities, recreational access to nature, and your local identity. And then finally, our vision is to really put North Carolina forward as an implementer and a demonstrator of what the best practices are with resilience. So with that, I will leave you with my contact information at the end. and then I will turn it directly over to Mr. Kim Carlson from Division of Water Infrastructure.
Thank you, Dr. Whitehead. A lot of what I'm going to talk about with respect to water infrastructure today is going to mirror a lot of the things that we just heard. From the water infrastructure perspective, resiliency is something you see in our master plan. In the master plan, it really begins with a term we call viability. And viability is simply generating sufficient revenue to provide long-term reliable water service, and is based on three key focal areas: organizational, financial, and then infrastructure. And I said those things in intentional order because the viability of a utility, the resiliency of a utility really starts with the organization. And you've got to have the financial aspects in place to make the infrastructure happen. So that's all intentional. If you want a copy of our master plan, you can obtain it on our website as well, if you're interested in that. That master plan has kind of led us to working with a lot of rural communities, and we really see a lot of our rural communities struggling with utility viability. But moving those communities to viability is one of our main programmatic goals. And a viable system is going to be in a better position to do the resiliency planning, since they are more likely to have that organizational capacity, and that capacity helps them to better understand the risk. And of course, Dr. Whitehead talked a lot about the different types of risk and understanding that risk just now. But understanding that risk and understanding the impact if the risk is realized can lead to decisions that will make the utility more resilient. And of course, as we've been talking about, risk comes in many, many different forms. For a lot of the communities we work with, it's not just a flood risk. A lot of times it's also an economic risk as well. A lot of our larger cities, you know, if there's a manufacturing plant or something like that that closes, it's one thing. But for our smaller systems, and not only just for the town, but also for the water and wastewater utility, that same plant closing can really be devastating. So understanding these risks and how these can impact the community is very important for our rural systems. And our smaller utilities, they really are operating with very, very little room for error. There's just almost no margin of error for them. We do offer a number of different types of funding programs. The Division of Water Infrastructure administers state revolving fund programs at the federal level. We have a state program that's loans and grants, and we also administer part of the state CDBG program. So let me kind of run through some of the different things that we can offer to help from a planning standpoint and an implementation standpoint. First, we have merger regionalization feasibility grants. These can really help utilities study, is there a more viable option, a more resilient option out there that we can use to provide that water and wastewater services. The other one is asset inventory and assessment grants. And these can be used to better define the location of water infrastructure. A lot of that infrastructure is buried underground. A lot of times it was put in 50, 60, 70 years ago, and the exact location may not be known. It also helps you analyze what the risk is. Is it in the floodplain? Is it out? What are the risks to the community of that infrastructure? You know, do you have a single water line supplying a critical aspect of the community, something like a hospital? So you can understand those risks and then lay out your operation needs and your capital improvement needs that hopefully can mitigate some of those risks. We also provide project funding with our low interest loan programs, and we do have some grant programs. Now, our low interest loan programs save thousands and thousands in interest, and they are our largest programs. So there's a lot more capacity with these loan programs than we have with our grant programs. And from a project funding standpoint, we recently revised our priorities system. The first and foremost priority is moving a non-viable utility into viability. And that's something that we've just recently done. We've long prioritized green infrastructure, and Dr. Whitehead showed some of that green infrastructure and how it can be used. Our Clean Water SRF program can fund stormwater BMPs and some of that green infrastructure. Again, it's a loan program, not a grant program, but still the interest savings can be substantial. In those programs, we've also added resiliency as an aspect of our priority system, moving infrastructure out of the floodplain or protecting it in different ways can gain priority points. So when you're replacing that wastewater pump station that may be near a creek, if we have two projects and one's keeping it in the floodplain and one's moving it out, the project moving out of the floodplain is going to receive a higher priority. So these are some of the ways that we've been kind of working with our State Water Infrastructure Authority to better prioritize getting our utilities as a whole to be more viable, more resilient, but also the infrastructure itself to become more resilient. A lot of details in those priority systems, way too many to kind of go into today. We do training before every one of our funding rounds, so look out for those. They'll help you kind of guide you through that priority system and understand how your particular projects can fit and score out in our priority system. We also have guidance on the webpage. And of course, if you have questions, you feel free to call me or any of our staff here at the Division of Water Infrastructure. So with that, let me kind of go through an example of how these different programs are used and how they can build a resilient and viable utility. So we've recently been working really close, as I mentioned, with a lot of our smaller towns across the state. And one in particular came to us a couple of years ago and described how their financial situation was, and they were in real dire straits. Our local government commission oversees local government finance across the state, and they were definitely on the local government commission's radar. In fact, they told us they only had a couple of years before they looked like they were going to head toward bankruptcy. So they obtained a merger regionalization feasibility grant to explore other options. Were there other more financially resilient, organizationally resilient, and infrastructure resilient options out there in providing those water and wastewater services? The study of that grant, the results, they decided that consolidating with a larger utility was the way to go for them. We then provided an asset inventory and assessment grant because the larger utility wanted to make sure it did its due diligence so that it knew what it was taking over and would understand and make sure they weren't penalizing their existing customer base by helping out this smaller utility. That was done. We then provided construction funding. That construction funding in some cases just included simple repairs, but we knew from that asset inventory and assessment grant what those repairs needed to be. And then one of the main projects to facilitate this merger happening was moving a wastewater pump station out of the floodplain. And it was prone to flooding, and over the last 10 years had been flooded multiple times. So that was kind of a physical need to happen to make this merger take place. So you can see how going through and first studying the options, deciding what the best organizational financial situation was for them moving forward led to the asset inventory and assessment grant, led to project funding, moving infrastructure out of the floodplain. As a result of all this, they're in the process of merging with that larger utility, and that larger utility is going to now provide more staffing, a larger variety of staff that will be operating for the utility. So in this small town had, I think, 2 utility staff. So now they have access to repair crews, multiple operators, an engineering department, and management staff. So from an organizational standpoint, this small town is going from having 2 operator type staff now to they have a whole utility department to rely on and to have access to. So being part of that larger utility also is going to make them more economically resilient as well. You know, it's a small town, really small customer base. You have that one large user leave, it can really make things critical from a financial standpoint. One large infrastructure fails, you know, with a small system, it can be really critical for that town. Now, as part of a larger utility, they have better planning, they have better operation, they'll get a longer life out of their infrastructure. If something does fail, they're part of a much larger customer base, and so therefore they're much more resilient. So working with small towns across the state has kind of led us working with the local government commission, working with the legislature and the governor's office to come up with a new viable utility program. And that program provides a complete evaluation of the utility, organizationally, financially, and infrastructure, updates that infrastructure and provides for a long-term financial plan by resetting the utility, getting in place the organizational structure that's needed, making sure the finances make sense, and that sort of thing. In many cases, it'll be merging with another utility. It could just simply be resetting the utility, fixing the old infrastructure, and then putting in place the organizational planning efforts to make sure that lasts long term. The result, we hope, is going to be viable utilities more and more across the state that have that organizational and financial capacity, and as a result, the infrastructure itself will be more resilient. So the State Water Infrastructure Authority and the Local Government Commission, the two boards we're working with on this program, had their first joint meeting yesterday, and we're just starting to implement this program, but hopefully this is going to lead to a lot of our smaller systems, provide them with the financial help and the organization at the end of the day that leads to a financially and infrastructure resilient utility. The unfortunate part about all of this is in our viable utility program, we have very limited funding right now. The statutes were passed and signed by the governor this summer, and they came with just $9 million in one-time funds. Small town that I mentioned that we were working with, that total funding package was over $4 million. So we have hundreds of systems out there. We don't know how many are going to need this funding, but if it's 50 to 100, you can tell that 9 million isn't going to address all of those. So hopefully we'll have some more funding. And hopefully as the next year, as we get into the next legislative session, we can work out a way to have this program funded and provide that mechanism for our small systems to move forward and be more resilient and become viable utilities. So that's it for me. Misty?
Hi, thank you, Kim, and thank you, Jess, for those great informative presentations. We are going to move into the Q&A section now, and as I mentioned earlier, if you could use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and our panelists will address those accordingly. We do have, to start off with, Kim, a question for you. Can you give some more examples of water systems recovering from flood damage?
Sure. We've worked with one small town that we provided some disaster recovery funding and infrastructure funding, but also we provide a lot of technical assistance to them. And part of the result of flood damage to their community, they had some flood damage to the actual infrastructure, but one of the bigger impacts to their utility was the fact that a lot of their residents lived in the floodplain and had to move out of town. And because of that, many of them took the buyout programs, and they lost a substantial part of their customer base. In fact, it was probably about 30%. Financially, that had a huge impact on their utility and made those infrastructure impacts even more critical. So we provided some infrastructure funding to move some of that infrastructure out of the floodplain to protect other aspects that couldn't be moved out of the floodplain. And we've been working with them to try and figure out, is there a different way for them to provide those services that's going to be a little more financially resilient? Because those type impacts to the utility weren't just infrastructure impacts. They were the impacts on the customer base that then resulted to impacts on their financial aspects of the utility.
Great. Jess, a question for you. In your work, what do you wake up in the middle of the night worrying about?
I just saw that one. I went, ooh, that's going to be somebody who watches my Twitter account and knows that I end up awake in the middle of the night. I think that to me, the most challenging thing, and thinking back again to the Swansboro example, you know, they really thought that the worst that anything could ever throw at us was 15 inches of rain. And within 2 weeks, they'd gotten double that in a single event. And Florence, quite frankly, was still not anywhere close to what Mother Nature can throw at us. And certainly not a you know, climate change fueled Mother Nature. You know, we know that we've had storms like Harvey in Texas that had 40, 50-inch rainfall totals. We know that there are really long-term challenges. Anybody who was in the Carolinas in the 2000s know that we had a really, really deep drought. We had places that were running out of water. And we've continued to develop the rural areas between Charlotte and the Triad and the Triangle. So not only are we looking at, you know, potentially deeper droughts from a climate perspective, we're jacking up the demand on that. And these are really big challenges. And I think what keeps me up at night about those is not how big the challenges are, but how do we really make sure that everyone is included in developing a solution? It's very, very easy for anybody to sit up here in Raleigh and say, I'm going to make this decision. But when we make quick decisions and we make the decisions that are the easiest to make with the fewest number of people, we leave out the most vulnerable people, whether that's by exposure because they live in floodplains, whether it is you know, low and moderate income people who don't have as many financial resources, whether it's communities of color who are still bearing the harm from decades and centuries of systemic racism. And developing those solutions in a way that acknowledges these really, really big challenges is hard. And it's not how government is used to working, but it's something where I, as the Chief Resilience Officer, and my staff, you know, Dr. Amanda Martin, Marlena Byrne, who are my deputies, are really, really committed to finding a pathway. But we know it's going to be hard. And that is what keeps me up in the middle of the night. And if you're ready to hear more about equity and that role from somebody who's not a you know, bureaucrat from Raleigh, Dr. John Cooper is next week's speaker, and he is really going to go into this from a full, deep perspective.
Jess, before you mute yourself, let me just shoot one more question your way. Can you talk about how long-term resilience strategies are different from traditional disaster recovery?
Sure. You know, thinking about, you know, when I was a girl, my storm was Hurricane Hugo. And I think I saw somebody in there on the list from Charleston County in South Carolina. I lived in West Ashley by a quirk of the fact that my mom was a grad student at the time, and we were doing her required on-campus residency in Illinois when the storm hit. We had to recover as second homeowners, even though we were living in a grad student apartment that had barn swallows living in it. It was just that kind of condition. And, you know, single mom having to go through that experience when Hugo tore the chimney off. And when I think back to Charleston, it was, you know, really, really easy to build things back just the way that they were, or to, you know, put a lot more investment here. Hey, let's make it new, let's make it big, let's make it touristy. And the challenge, and, you know, is when I go back to Charleston and thinking about that, not to throw anybody from Charleston under the bus, is that it really was easier to put everything back the way it was. It was easier to build back to the minimum. It was faster. Nobody had to have hard conversations. And when we think about disaster resilience and climate resilience, it's thinking about that wasn't the worst that we could go through. And how do you make things bigger? How do you sometimes relocate things? And when you relocate things, how do you then let go of the place that was? That's a little bit of the difference to me. It's that longer term view, and what can be really, really scary when we think about that kind of transformation, but it can also be an opportunity. And I think that we can hold that fear and that optimism at the same time as we think about, long-term resilience strategies. But they're also a lot easier to talk about those long-term resilience strategies in blue sky conditions like we have right now. When you go through a disaster, you just want everything to be whole again, even though the reality is that nothing is ever the same. But that's kind of my thought. And Kim, I think you can address this too better than I can in the water context, because water and wastewater infrastructure is another big one that always worries me.
Yeah, and I think what keeps me up at night with respect to water infrastructure is just the financial condition of so many of our small towns. And I think it's a lot easier to deal with the issues related to water utilities and water infrastructure now, before the disaster strikes, whether that's a flooding disaster or a financial disaster. Like you were saying, it's a lot easier to deal with this with the blue skies. It's also, I think, for a lot of our smaller communities, easier to do this on a regional basis and through a lot of collaboration. I think there's got to be collaboration at the state level and at the local level and across multiple agencies as well.
Thank y'all both. One other question, how do you see collaboration with neighboring states, since flooding doesn't stop at state lines, and work more on a watershed level?
Ooh, very good question. I really have to, give a shout out to Environmental Defense Fund here, because they have been one of the organizations, along with organizations like Pew, like the Georgetown Policy Forum, that have been facilitating these kinds of interstate discussions so that we can learn lessons from each other. And that watershed approach has been used in Iowa. It has been used in Louisiana. But cross-boundary gets to be a challenge, because a lot of the times, it came up in the context of beginning to look at our BRIC applications. How do you deal with a watershed that goes across state lines? And how do you apply for that funding? I think this is something where, there's a lot of synergies, especially in the PD and the Waccamaw with South Carolina. There's a lot of synergies with northeastern North Carolina, especially our rural areas. And some of what's been done in southeastern Virginia, Virginia Beach, Virginia is strange as a commonwealth. They have these municipalities that are the size of counties. And there's urbanized Virginia Beach, and then there's all of Virginia Beach that is primarily rural and has the back bay and farms and all of that stuff. And they've done a lot there that we could learn from, but I think we also have a lot to offer them. So, if the more that we have these collaborations and knowledge sharing opportunities, I think the more opportunities we'll have to really be able to scope up off projects, and quite frankly, continue to, say and look for opportunities where, all right, if the federal government isn't going to do this, then the states need to find a way.
Kim, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No.
Do we have any more questions? Not seeing any, but here's our last call.
Misty, did we answer the one that came in about saltwater intrusion?
We did not. That one's for you, Kim. Is saltwater intrusion a growing issue in coastal North Carolina?
That's not an area that I work real closely in, but I know some of the municipalities that we work with have done some work along those lines, and have looked closer and closer at that. Some of the projects that we've worked on before are kind of things you can do to kind of block that saltwater intrusion. I think really it's just part of a larger water resource question that's out there. A lot of times when we talk about resiliency, it is about flooding and large precipitation events, but drought, as Dr. Whitehead mentioned, is also a significant issue. And of course, it's been a while since we've had a significant drought, and when they used to occur about once every 10 years. So I think, whether it's surface water and how much storage we have in that surface water supplies, in our aquifers across the state. You know, we were really successful in implementing the capacity use regulations, and other things like saltwater intrusion. You really have to view all of that collectively.
And I can add a little bit to that one from a different perspective than water. Before I was the Chief Resilience Officer at NCORE, I was the Coastal Hazards Adaptation Specialist with North Carolina Sea Grant. And I see some very familiar names on the list of attendees. Chris Cahoon-Noble, who's now the county manager for Hyde County, was actually one of my first project partners who I worked on when I moved up to North Carolina full time. And Hyde County, mainland Dare County, parts of the Cape Fear River, these, parts of Carteret and Onslow. These are places where we're beginning to see saltwater intrusion and impacts to forests and ghost trees. In some cases, it's, sea level rise. In some cases, it's that flip between drought and flood that wicks water up places where we've dug canals. If you're driving out Highway 64 toward, the Outer Banks, you'll see a lot of those places where it's wicked up. Where that comes in is when you start to lose those trees, vegetation is really important to trying to hold on to that soil. And so ultimately, when you lose those trees, you lose the uptake of that water, those trees begin to decay, you're going to start to see shoreline erosion in some of those places. Ultimately, they'll transfer from being forest to open water. And I mean, I've been out, for those of you who know commercial fishing, right before Florence, I was out on the deck of the Albatross with Captain Ernie Foster. And he was able to, take me out into Hatteras Inlet and say, all right, I've got the boat in this place where when I was a boy and I learned how to drive, I came out here and was doing donuts in a pickup truck to learn how to drive. And now it's open water. And so that's the transition that happens. It has a tremendous impact on our farmers. There are a number of farmers on the very edge with farms in Hyde County that either through surge or through wicking up underneath from the groundwater or through wicking in those canals have had to change crops to cotton, which is a little bit more drought or salt tolerant. And then eventually you get to the point where there's a burn and you just can't grow anything. And then there's also in some places, it's not just drinking water, but it's also the function of septic systems. So if you're in a coastal county or somewhere along that brackish water in the sounds, you have a lot of septic systems. What happens when you have those septic systems and those drain fields sitting in saltier water for longer periods of time? You begin to see less effective, bacterial treatment of that sewage. And you have some of the coastal towns who are actually beginning to see increases in fecal coliform bacteria after big rain events or times when the groundwater table has been high, because then it's fecal bacteria leaching out of these septic systems. So saltwater intrusion is beginning to have those impacts in North Carolina, and we can see it, and we're really starting to document it.
Great, thank you, Jess. We are getting close to time to wrap up, but if we have one more question, if anyone wants to submit one more in the chat, we do have time for one more. Okay. Thank you all so much for joining us today, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this very important conversation. And thank you, Kim and Jess, for being a part of it and sharing all your insight and expertise with everyone. We do have two more webinars following. We have one next week on the 21st at 11 a.m. So that's next Wednesday at 11 a.m. And that one is going to be a building accessible for all. And this is going to focus on equity and inclusion principles and strategies so that we're including all in a community as we plan for the future and think about our positive outcomes. And then the following week on October 28th, also a Wednesday at 11 a.m., a building of warmth and light. And these are strategies to support rural leaders during challenging times. So we hope that you can join us for both of those. Registration for those webinars is on the Rural Center website, ncruralcenter.org. It's on the home page, and that registration is still open. So please consider joining us for those. You will on Monday, the 19th, receive the slides from this presentation, as well as the recording of the webinar. That if you feel so inclined to go back and listen to any or part of it, or to share it with others in your network who may have missed it and be interested in hearing the content, please feel free to do so. Once the webinar today ends, you will receive a survey. As I mentioned earlier, please take a brief few minutes to complete that for us, to give us your feedback. This is how we try to improve and deliver the best trainings and content to you all as possible. So please do that, and you will also be entered into a drawing for the Red Cross emergency pack once you complete the survey. And so with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks again for joining us, and hope to see you next week.